Hey everyone, Argonath here. So another look at what's happening in New Zealand. Today we're going to be looking at why saliva testing for COVID-19 hasn't been well implemented in New Zealand. So it might be of interest to people that are outside of New Zealand, and not many people in New Zealand kind of know this stuff as well. I only came across it a few weeks ago. So here's a Facebook post from Winston Peters, who was a former Deputy Prime Minister, but his party got, so if you're out of New Zealand, his party didn't get enough votes to get back in the current term. So let's have a read of his post here. So I have today sent a letter to the Auditor General requesting investigation into the government's $60 million procurement contract with Asia Pacific Health Group. On the 4th of August 2020, the New Zealand Super Fund, which is a pension fund run by the New Zealand government, and a Canadian pension fund acquired APHG for a reported $550 million. So now it's owned by the New Zealand Super Fund, which is pretty much owned by the government and the people that put their money into it, and a Canadian pension fund. So part owned by the government. So on the 12th of March 2021, the government put out a $60 million contract for 12 months. So $60 million over 12 months of saliva testing, just for 1 year. The tender period was 2 weeks, closing on the 26th of March. So of the tenders received, only one company, Reiko Science, had COVID saliva testing accreditation qualifications. So only one company had a saliva test which had been accredited as working. Amazing. So Reiko Science, a New Zealand company, which is great, obtained validation and accreditation for saliva testing for COVID in December 2020, 3 months earlier. So 3 months ago, before the 12th of March, when the tender was put up, they had an accredited test for saliva testing. So this is the weird bit. So on the 26th of May 2021, the government, despite the critical requirement of saliva testing validation and accreditation being absent, signed a $60 million contract with APHG. What the F, right? So you've got one hand a company that has an accredited test that had been developed 3 months earlier, and then you've got a company which doesn't have an accredited test, and you give it to the one without accreditation. What the F? What are you going on about, New Zealand government? Something's a bit fishy, right? Is that because your New Zealand Super Fund is part owner of this company? So the award date was 10th of June 2021. Reiko Science had been validated and accredited months earlier and ready to roll out widespread saliva testing. They have since entered into contracts with private organisations, but not the government. So basically, Reiko is doing saliva testing, but for private organisations in New Zealand, but the government can't see fit to use them. They're going to go for an untested, unaccredited one. What the F? So, oh my God. The government contractor APHG's product has not been tested and is yet to make any difference to the government testing program. When did he post this? The 9th of September. So it still hasn't been accredited. Here's some awesome questions to be asked of the government. Number 1, was the recommendation for saliva testing made only to assist the New Zealand Super Fund's latest acquisition as of the 4th of August? That's a good question. Who were the decision makers involved in this procurement? Yes, I'd like to know who the decision makers were as well. What influences came into play that ignored an accredited and validated option in favour of one that had neither? Okay, so you got an accredited and validated one. What are your reasons for not choosing that you had to go for one which doesn't have any form of accreditation or validation? Stupid. Great question. Why did the government delay the introduction of saliva testing with all manner of dismissive statements, yet now favour APGH, whose product is not yet being tested? Good question again. Number 5. Why has a validated and accredited saliva test achieved widespread use around the world, but is being sidelined in New Zealand? Oh my God. This is... Okay. Number 6. Is it a mere coincidence that the original Raco Science offer of service to government was 60 million? The precise figure that APHG offered the government? That's an interesting question. Why did the government decide to support the New Zealand Super Fund and Canadian Pension Fund option at the expense of the health and well-being of New Zealanders? Because this pathetic government is all about, oh, we want to be well, want to keep all our citizens well and healthy and so on, and be kind to one another. But you've got this test out here that will help with saliva testing so that we don't have to do invasive PCR nasal swabs. But no, we can't go for the accredited one. We want to go for the one which we have some money in. Number 8. Why have we heard for months dismissive statements about saliva testing from the government, and yet the Sir Brian Roche, Heather Simpson report of 28 September 2020, a year ago, stated saliva testing should be rolled out as soon as possible? So this was a report that the government undertook as to what it should be doing with its COVID-19 response. And so a year ago in that report it stated that saliva testing should be rolled out as soon as possible. And here we are on the 13th of September and we still do not have any form of saliva testing for government departments. We have it for private enterprise because private enterprise is always so much better than governmental stuff. That's the thing. So we've got a really cool article written by someone about this particular thing. So yeah, here we go. So from Dilipa Fonseca, this was on August the 22nd, so a while ago, but it outlines what's gone on. Where shall we start? So, so Raco Science Executive Director Leon Grice says that the event that they were held to celebrate Raco's efforts in getting the New Zealand Olympic team tested for COVID-19 as per pre-departure requirements, but Grice's message is more about the future of New Zealand's fight with COVID-19. So basically the New Zealand Olympic team used Raco Science's saliva testing regime tests to prove that they didn't have COVID-19 before flying out. So if you look at the New Zealand Olympic Committee's website, so the New Zealand Olympic team now have access to new non-invasive saliva PCR tests for COVID-19. Some 1,000 plus tests will be required to fulfill the pre-departure Olympic Games requirements for the New Zealand team to Tokyo 2020. So you would expect that the organisers of Tokyo 2020 will be very strict in terms of who they allow into the Olympic Games Committee, Olympic Games Village. They don't want people who might have the virus. So they're going to have to rely on really accurate tests, right? So obviously then that Raco Science will provide the PCR saliva test as the new official supplier for the New Zealand Olympic and Paralympic teams for Tokyo and Beijing Olympics. So obviously they must be held in high regard for the Olympic Committee to allow the Raco Science PCR saliva test to be used. It's so frustrating. So anyway, the Olympic Committee goes on to more about it. So here's a little bit about the test. So the Raco Science saliva test is New Zealand's only scientifically validated test, and its contracted medical testing laboratory has been accredited by IANZ to process these tests. The test is PCR, not antigen, and is fast, non-invasive, and highly accurate. So Raco Science developed the test based on overseas research. They hire a medical laboratory, so they produce the test, they hire a medical laboratory to perform the tests and give us the outcomes of each test. And the testing laboratory is also accredited by IANZ, which I assume is some sort of medical group that does these sorts of things. So obviously it must be a pretty good test for this to go on. So why is the New Zealand government not using this particular test? It's so stupid. Let's have a look at the Raco Science webpage. So Raco Science has worked hard and fast to ensure that New Zealanders have access to the only diagnostically validated COVID-19 PCR saliva test in New Zealand, the only one, complete with IANZ accreditation. Raco Science, so it wasn't just created by Reiko Science. The test was designed by University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign scientists. So they're listed there. You can read that if you want. They created a testing and mitigation strategy called COVID Shield. So it's not just created by Reiko Science, it's actually created overseas and they're using it. So they use it for pre-departure testing for people leaving New Zealand. It's used for surveillance testing in New Zealand, so it's used by a lot of big firms. So Reiko Science is providing COVID-19 testing to Genesis Energy, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, Air New Zealand, Waiparira Trust, multiple major international film production companies, and a wide range of small to medium-sized businesses. Come on, a major international film production company is not going to use some wonky test. They're going to use a test which has been accredited and works. What are you going on about, New Zealand government? So let's go back to this article here. So we go down. So it's down a bit further. So here's a amazing statistic. So at this stage, just last week, so remember this was written on 22nd of August, so 1 week before the 22nd of August, Response Minister Chris Hipkins revealed that 44% of approximately 1,000 port workers have not received a single vaccine jab. Oh my God, seriously, what are you doing, New Zealand government? You can't even get border workers, port workers vaccinated. Grice says we can't test frequently because nasal swabs are so invasive. I haven't had one, but I've heard they're pretty bad, and it takes longer to process. He argues a system of frequent saliva testing could allow us to isolate cases at the border earlier, even before we find out about an accidental breach. So saliva testing should be used to help us to find people who are infected with COVID-19 before they actually become infectious. Just over a week later, hundreds if not thousands of people were queuing up for COVID-19 tests with lines snaking around the block in Auckland. 10-hour wait times just to get tested because of the outbreak and because we didn't have saliva testing because the government is useless. Grice is an advocate for saliva testing, a type of testing which is becoming more widespread around the world, if only because the alternative is too painful to do regularly enough to stay on top of things. So this is used around the world. Get with the program, New Zealand government. So it talks about how the saliva test is actually done. You just draw some saliva into a spoon and put it in a container. Don't have to have something stuck all the way up your nose and jiggled around a bit and all that kind of stuff. So it gets a bit interesting later on. So the science behind it has been around for nearly a year. Anne Wiley, a New Zealand scientist at Yale University, found saliva testing could be just as effective as the more painful nasal swab kind and potentially better at early detection. The working theory is the virus may form in the saliva glands first before making its way to the back of the throat. Domestically, there have been growing calls for us to start using it, outlined in the Roche report that I talked about in one of the other articles. That was delivered to the government in late September. 2020, that is, not 2021. All efforts should be made to introduce saliva testing as soon as possible. So we're still here in 1 year later in September 2021, and we still don't have saliva testing for all of our government employees and so on. Have it for private employees through Reiko Science, but not through the government because they're useless. Alright, so let's have a look at the tender process. So this is quite interesting. So the Ministry of Health tender processes started in March. The original tender document indicated it wanted a company to be able to roll out saliva testing by the middle of April. Yeah, right. Needless to say, things didn't go quite to plan. No shit, Sherlock. So obviously it hasn't gone to plan because we haven't got it yet. So let's have a look. So Associate Professor of Victoria University of Wellington School of Biological Sciences, Janet Pittman, says saliva testing can produce comparably accurate results which are just as good as those you get from a nasal swab, although she acknowledges the public perceives otherwise. She says the misunderstandings have been largely driven by politicians and officials, confused by the wide variety of saliva testing methods out there because they are dumb and useless. Right? The problem with saliva testing is there are so many tests on the market, they all vary, some good, some bad. But Rako Science's test came out of the University of Illinois study for saliva testing called the COVID Shield. It is different from the ones associated with Wiley's work at Yale, but the two methods use similar processes. Grice said they got into saliva testing business through their research relationship with the University of Illinois after noticing the distinct advantage saliva testing offered: early detection. The University of Illinois conducted 2.3 million tests on 46,000 people, and nearly 7,000 of them tested positive. Of these, the COVID Shield identified 85% before they became infectious. Is that amazing or what? We could detect 85% of people that had the virus before they became infectious. And here we are, the government sitting on their hands, umming and ahhing about how to get saliva testing in when we already have it available in New Zealand through Rako Science. To bring the process over to New Zealand, Grice says Rako knew it would need to get the test diagnostically validating using real-world samples of COVID-19. The test was validated by Pittman, who compared test results from saliva and nasal swabs imported from the United States. And just in case you're thinking, I have no financial deals with Rako Science or anything like that, they haven't paid me any money, I have no shares or anything like that, they're the one that have the test that we need to be using. Both tests were similarly accurate, with the saliva test detecting an early infection but wasn't detected in the nasal swab, and with the saliva test failing to detect a large stage infection that was picked up in the nasal swab sample. So you'd still need to use both, but the saliva test will pick up things before they become infectious. When Rako attempted to bring its test to the attention of the ministry, it was met with a lukewarm reception, then called in for a presentation in February. Of course it's lukewarm because the politicians are useless. Rako Science's Chief Science Officer Stephen Grice says the skepticism was expressed by MOH officials at the February meeting was understandable because every good scientist is a skeptic, but turns his attention to making the case at the government tender stage where the government was looking for someone to administer the $16 million saliva-based surveillance testing contract for its border workforce. So here we go. At the end of February tender, a much more well-established provider was chosen over Rako Science, the Asia Pacific Healthcare Group, a respected company that conducts much of the pathology testing in New Zealand. So yes, they were well-established, and yes, they had been taken over by the New Zealand Super Fund and the Canadian Pension Fund. I wonder if that made a difference. Except, in this instance, they didn't actually have a diagnostically validated saliva test. So yep, let's just go for the company that might be able to detect it, that might not, because they don't have a validated test yet, but we'll just employ them anyway. What the hell, I'm sure they'll get it. Instead of importing or using real-world samples of COVID-19, APHG would check a test using samples of saliva artificially spiked with COVID-19, which Carpenter says means the test has technical validation rather than diagnostic validation. So it's not using real-world samples. The test they're going to use for validation is not real-world. Technical validation, which confirms that so we're over here now, confirms that analytically the test used to detect COVID-19 has been completed for all of the saliva tests for use in Asia Pacific Health Group laboratories. But the only way to check a test really works is in the real world is to test against real world samples. But APHG didn't do that. They only spiked the saliva with the virus. It's not real world. Whereas Rako's one is using real world samples. Even though it's from the US, who cares? Who gives a shit? Right? It's still real world. Shouldn't be that much different from what's in New Zealand. So since the tender was awarded to New Zealand saliva test was awarded to APHG, not to Rako Science, New Zealand saliva testing rollout has fallen further and further behind the original schedule because they didn't have a friggin' validated test. They're still going through their validation process. Leon Grice says an accurate saliva test is not just about the test itself, but your whole procedure around it, including how you collect the samples and treat them. Rako just had a head start in figuring it out and oversees links to a university that is a leader in it. So this is the amazing bit. Rako's secret sauce, the secret sauce in Rako's procedure is one used to heat the saliva samples into a water bath for 30 minutes at 95 degrees Celsius. This does three things. It renders the virus harmless. Awesome. Means that if anyone handles their saliva tests, they're not going to become infected because the virus has been rendered harmless. So that is pretty good. It denaturizes enzymes in saliva that might interfere with the polymerase chain reaction, so the PCR test used on saliva. So yep, get rid of anything that could affect the outcome of the PCR test. Awesome. And third, it cracks open the virus and makes the RNA available for PCR machines, which takes out a time-consuming RNA extraction process. So that's how it speeds up compared to the other one. So it breaks open the virus, you can get the RNA out of the virus, and it can be picked up much more quickly. So all of this combined allows a much faster test turnaround time. Some of the big users of this test are people flying out to Europe, where people often need a valid PCR test result 48 hours before they enter a European country. With Roko's test, they can take a test in the morning, get the result in the afternoon, just in time for their flight. Seems pretty awesome, right? We've always wanted to be part of the solution, and we didn't have to be part of the main solution. So New Zealand government, get off your ass. Either get Roko onto it, or put APHG under a blowtorch and get them to get their test validated. If it doesn't validate, then go to Roko Science. I'm just really frustrated with how this government is handling. They initially handled it well, locking down at the very beginning, but the new lockdowns and things, they've just been handling it really, really badly. So I'm really frustrated with this. So it comes through in my recording, so I apologize for that. But I know that a lot of other places are also a lot worse off than New Zealand, but it just makes me so frustrated when we could be doing some really good things in New Zealand, but we can't just because of poor incompetence by the government. Anyway, that's it from Argonath from The Right Way. Again, please subscribe if you found it enjoyable. I'm hopefully producing more content each day as new things come out that we need to talk about, or that I need to talk about. It's just a way for me to get things off my chest. It makes me feel better in the long run. And please like this recording. That way, hopefully other people might pick it up in the YouTube algorithm. Alright, that's it for me. Catch you in the next one, hopefully.